Hi everyone, welcome to November's Stitch Guide, and this month we are going to be exploring what I think are some of the trickiest stitches to get right. Although the technique is really straightforward, getting the finish right is quite an art and takes some practice. So we're going to be exploring film stitches this month, and I'm going to hopefully show you the stitches and show you some tricks that you can use along the way to try and maximise the quality of finish that you achieve. So the first stitch we are going to look at is Satin Stitch, and I'm going to work that in this circle here. And I've just got 3 strands here of a stranded thread. And what we're going to try and do is make sure these threads lay flat. The reason I like doing this stitch with a stranded cotton is that the strands separate and can lie much flatter and give you much better coverage. So I've knotted the end there, and I'm just going to take my fingernail and pull along the thread to flatten it out, and that is going to cause my needle to spin a little bit at the end, and that just makes sure that my threads aren't too twisted together. So I'm going to start by coming up on the outside edge of my shape, and I'm going to start in an unusual way, but this is again another way to get a really good finish. What I'm going to do is backstitch around my shape. So I'm starting just at the top there, and I'm going to create a circle of backstitch. This is a really good way of getting a precise shape, because this backstitch is going to form almost like a border that we stitch around. It's going to give you a really good guide to where your shape begins and ends, and it's going to help you work out where to place your needle to get a really clear and precise shape. Now, an option here is to add some seed stitch into the centre of your circle, and I'm just going to do that so that you can see the effect of what's created. What this is going to do is sort of pad out this shape, so that because my stitches are going to be raised at the edge, this helps to prevent the finished shape sort of looking sunken in the middle. And I am working with quite a sizable shape here, so I'm just going to pad this a little bit. Now, seed stitch is a great fill stitch actually, because it's possible to change the size and length of your stitches and the spacing between them in order to create a sort of graduated look. So that's my seed stitch fill. I could leave it like that if I wanted to, but I'm going to satin stitch over the top of this now. So I'm going to take another 3 strands of thread. I want everything nice and even on this shape. So I'm going to bring my needle up just on the outside edge of my backstitch shape, and what we're trying to do is get our stitches to not just lie as close to each other as possible, but all in the same direction. I'm going to just lay the thread across the shape so that I get the line right. Then I'm going to take my needle back down just on the outside of that backstitch line. I don't want to pull it too tight, I just want the thread to sit nicely like that. So now I'm going to bring my needle back up at the top edge, just outside my backstitch lines, as close to that first stitch as I possibly can. And satin stitch is best worked in a hoop, because you will tend to pull the fabric and pucker it, and your work won't lay flat. And then I come back up just a little bit further along, and I'm trying really hard to lay my thread right next to the stitch that I've just done, and again right at the edge, and I'm following the line of the outline of the shape, always working just outside my back stitch line. So I'm working from the centre to the outside, keeping my stitches heading in the same direction every single time. I'm just going to put in my last stitch here, and because it's a circle, I just want to sort of make sure that my needle is tucked under there, otherwise I'm going to give my circle a peculiar shape. So there we go, that's me stitched all the way to the edge. Now another way of making sure that you get your lines totally parallel is to put in some bars first. You can see I'm laying the thread so that it's parallel with the previous bar and then stitching it across. And so now what I do is fill in the gaps between those bars. Okay, so there's Satin Stitch. You can see it's a fairly smooth finish. I much prefer just the laying the threads next to each other approach. You've got to find which way works for you. I find the bar approach makes me go a little bit lumpy, but you get a fairly smooth finish and a really solid fill. So that's Satin Stitch. The next stitch we're going to look at, we're going to work over here on this circle, and just as a disclaimer, this is not a stitch I enjoy and it's not a stitch that I feel particularly good at. This is a stitch called long and short stitch. It's sometimes known as thread painting or silk shading, but we're going to have a go over here, and you can see on my table I've got 3 shades of red here, a dark, a mid and a bright red, and we're going to create a sort of graduated effect. So I'm going to start on the lower portion of my circle, and again if you wanted to you could stitch an outline around this, but I'm just going to go for it. So I'm just doing sort of straight stitches, a bit like what I did with Satin Stitch. So I'm trying really hard to make them lay against each other, and I'm varying the height of them as I go. So the idea of this one is that we're going to create stitches that are different lengths. So some of them are longer, some of them are shorter, and the effect will be of a sort of blend of colours as we go from dark to mid to light. And what I'm trying to avoid is any sense of straight edges. What I don't want is for all my longer stitches to form a line. I want them to be quite random. So I've got my darkest colour here at the base of my shape. So there's my dark red. Now I'm going to come in with my mid-tone, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing, but this time I'm going to put my stitches in between the ones that I've already stitched. So I'm again varying the length of the stitches, just stitching a space where there isn't any dark red just to get me started. I'm meeting the dark red, so now I want to look at where those dark red stitches end, and I'm going to add my next colour at the end of those dark stitches and work down into the gaps. Now I do want to fill the space, so I'm looking for any places where the linen is showing through, and again I want to create a sort of ragged edge to my mid-tone stitches, so I don't want to create a hard line. So again I'm just varying the length of the stitch and tucking them in between my darker stitches. So now I'm going to come in with my lightest red, and I'm just going to fill in the remaining spaces, just working in exactly the same way. So I'm trying to make sure that these stitches are sort of interlocked with the ones I've already sewn, still always coming up on the edge of my shape. I'm stitching here with 3 strands, which I don't normally stitch with. I'm trying to make it really obvious for you how the stitches work together. To get a really fine finish on this, experts would suggest stitching with 1 strand, but you can experiment with different thread weights, thicknesses, different types of thread to achieve the effect that you're looking for. So again, I'm just going to rub my needle over the surface just to blend that in. But that's thread painting. It's not the most perfect thread painting you'll ever see, but at least you can see how the stitches work together to create that shaded dimensional effect. So the next one I'm going to show you is one of my absolute favourite ways to fill a space, and I'm going to work this on this large circle here. We're going to look at something called laid work, and you may be able to just about see that I've marked in the quarters of the circle here. Let me just make those a little bit more defined for you. And I'm going to also just eyeball 8s. This is going to be a little bit of a guide. So the first thing we're going to do is create a lattice across our circle. And I'm going to do that by joining up my quarter marks. I've joined up 3 o'clock and 12 o'clock. So now I'm going to come round to whatever o'clock this is and lay it across the centre like that. And then I'm going to join 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock. And now I'm going to fill the spaces in between. So you could add in more grid lines if you wanted to. I'm going to leave it at that. What I'm going to do is create a grid going in the opposite direction now. What's helpful is I can use the lines that I've already stitched in to help me position my lines going in the opposite direction. So I'm just joining up the ends of my lattice lines. So there's my lattice that I've laid over the surface. What we want to do is keep this really nice and tight, and so I've just got my darkest red here, and I'm going to look at the points where my lattices cross, and I'm going to bring my thread up just above where the crossing point of my diagonal lines is, and then I'm going to stitch over the top of that crossing point with a tiny little stitch, and then I'm going to come up to the left of that crossing point and stitch over to the right. So I'm effectively putting a little cross over the join there, and I'm going to do that at every single crossing point. I want to try and keep these little crosses as small as possible. There we go. Now obviously with this one you do have some open spaces. The shape is sort of defined, but if you want to, you could add a line of stitching around the edge. So I'm just going to back stitch around the outside outline of my circle. And I think I've decided I want to whip that. So that's laid work, that's a lattice work fill stitch, and just to show you, this is another example where the lines are worked much more closely together, and I've used lots of different colours for the crosses here. So this is the rainbow flower design that I did on my stitch journal, stitch alphabet book, and this central section is laid work with much smaller gaps between the lines, so that's how it can look. The next one I want to show you, we're going to work in this square here, and it's called brick stitch, and it's much more effectively stitched if you are working on counted fabric like Ada or Binker or even canvas, but it can be done on just normal fabric. This is just natural linen, and I just want to show you how to approach it. So I've got 6 strands in my needle here because I want to try and emphasize the effect. We're going to start off along this top edge of the square by just putting in some back stitches. So I've got a forward stitch there, and I'm just going to back stitch the rest of the line. I'm going to get 4 stitches in here, and it's really important that you try and keep your stitches as even as possible, because that is going to make a massive difference as you work your way down your shape. Now on the way back, I want to offset my next row of stitches, so I'm coming 1 thread width down the shape, and I'm bringing my needle up in the centre of that last stitch that I made. So I'm doing a sort of half back stitch back to the edge of the shape. Now I'm going to come up in the middle of that second stitch back and join that up with that half stitch that I just made. So we're creating a solid fill, but we're offsetting the stitches in each of our rows. So now I'm going to come up halfway along that third stitch back and join that up to the one that I just stitched. Then halfway along the very first stitch that I made, and back again to my previous stitch, and then we've got that little space left at the beginning of this row, and so I'm just going to put another little half stitch in to fill that gap. So we're basically making a brick wall out of our stitches. Now my next line of stitch is going to line up with that first line of stitches that I made. So again, I'm going to get 4 stitches across the width of my square here, keeping them really even, and they're each starting halfway along the stitches in the previous row. So now I'm on my 4th row, and I'm lining up with the second row of stitches that I made. So starting with a half stitch again, and then working halfway along the stitches on the previous row. And I'm just going to continue like this all the way down to fill the square. You might find it easier if you're working on fabric like this to put in some guidelines, so you can put vertical lines to guide where each of your stitches should begin and end. But you can do it without, as long as you are taking your time. So that's the effect. You can see it's a little bit ragged at the edges, and that's fairly normal if you're not working on counted fabric. So I'm just going to do some long stitches around the outside of my shape, and that will just hide any raggedness, neaten it up and create a little bit of a border. So these are just very long back stitches around the four sides of the shape. And that just neatens everything up. And you get this lovely textured, almost woven look. Really effective. Now the last few I want to show you are stitches that we have used quite a lot during our Winging It project, and I just want you to see that actually it's possible to use normal stitches that you would use on the surface as fill stitches. And the first one I want to show you is fly stitch. Now if you've been watching my videos at all, you will know that I am a massive fan of fly stitch. I use it often, and this can be used really effectively as a fill. Now we looked at fly stitch back in March when we did loop stitches, and just in case you have forgotten, I'm bringing my thread up on the outside edge of my shape. I'm taking it down on the opposite edge of my shape and I'm pulling through until I get a loop. Now I'm going to bring my needle up just at the bottom of where my first stitch ended there, and I'm going to make sure it's inside that loop, and when I pull tight it's going to pull that loop and catch it around that working thread, and then I make a straight stitch down and that anchors that V in place, and then I can bring up my needle just along the outside edge from where that previous stitch started, down on the opposite edge, just down from the previous stitch, up in the middle right at the centre of the previous stitch where that post was, and then I can make a little straight stitch to anchor that in place. And I'm going to work all the way down the outside of my shape, just changing the width of the stitch so that it always begins and ends on the outside edge of my shape. And you can see, hopefully, I'm using a pearl cotton here, you can hopefully see that those stitches, because they work so closely together, are actually filling the shape quite effectively, and I get a sort of pleated effect down the centre as well. So this is a really good one for leaves, because you almost are creating the veins of the leaves with your stitches. Hopefully you'll be able to see there the effect that's created. So we've got our fly stitches sitting next to each other and that anchor stitch forming almost like a vein. So that's a fly stitch fill. And another stitch that we looked at during our loop stitches month was blanket stitch, and I'm going to show you how blanket stitch can work as a fill as well. And before I start, I just want to put a central line up the middle of my shape there. That's going to help me. So I'm going to start off, you can see I've turned my hoop sideways. I'm going to do one half where I work my blanket stitches around the edge coming into the centre line, and then the other half I'm going to work where the blanket stitches worked along the centre line. So let's start off with coming up right on the edge of my shape at the centre point, and I'm going to take my needle down just next to that but along the centre line. Then I'm going to bring my needle back up along the outside edge. So this first stitch is going to be tiny. I'll come up on the outside edge there and I pull my blanket stitch through. So this is worked with the loop again. So again, down on the centre line, just along from where my previous stitch was, pull through to make a loop, and then come up inside the loop on my outside edge like that, and when I pull through, that is caught in place. So again, going down on my centre line, just along from where my previous stitch was, and pull through. So I'm creating a straight line down the centre with the ends of each stitch, and around the outside edge I'm getting a sort of ridged line from where those blanket stitches are forming around that loop. So that's working the blanket stitch around the edge. I'll show you up close shortly. I'm just going to do the bottom half of the leaf, showing you what happens when you work your blanket stitch along the centre line. So I'm going to do exactly the same process, but this time I'm working along the centre. Hopefully you can see. So this is the blanket stitch where I worked the loop at the outside edge. So you get that sort of ridged outline to your shape. This is where I worked it along the centre, so that creates the ridge along the centre of your shape, and you get a sort of looser, softer outside edge. So that's a blanket stitch fill. So another option is to use Cretan stitch. Now, we used Cretan stitch back in June, I believe, when we looked at decorative lines, and I love the look of Cretan stitch, but you can work it as a fill stitch. So again, I'm putting my centre line in. So I'm going to bring my thread up right at the tip of my line like that, and I'm going to take it down, just down to the right of that stitch along my outside line. I'm holding my working thread out because I want to bring my needle back up on my centre line and just make sure that my working thread passes under my needle. I want to catch that loop like that, and then I'm going to go put my working thread to the right and go in at my outside edge just on my centre line, making sure the working thread passes under the needle there like that. I'm going to go down on my outside edge again, just a little way down from that previous stitch to the right, and slide my needle up at the centre line, making sure my working thread passes under my needle. And then repeat on the left. And I'm going to work my way all the way down. Now I'm working my stitches a little bit spaced out. You can work these very, very close together if you want to, just like we've worked the fly stitch earlier, and you can make a completely solid fill. Bring it up close. You should be able to see you get that sort of ridge down the centre again, and as I say, here it's worked very close together. I tried to do it so that you could see, but you can also make it quite sort of breathy and wispy as well as you fill your shape. And the last one I want to show you is a herringbone stitch fill, and this again is worked just like normal herringbone stitch, but we work it so that the stitches are very close together. So we do our cross stitch, do a tiny back stitch, and then we're going to come up on the other side and then do our little back stitch back to right next to the previous stitch, and then take it across again, over to the other side and back on itself. So again, we covered this back in June when we were looking at decorative lines. So you can work this as open or as closed as you want to. And there we go. Herringbone worked really close together to create almost like a braided fill. So that's just an introduction really to fill stitches. This is an enormous area, but these are the sort of main ones. So we've looked at satin stitch, thread painting or silk shading or long and short stitch. We've got lattice work. That's a type of laid work where we're working mostly on the surface of the fabric. Then we did brick stitch, which is a great one for counted fabrics, but it can be done. And then we use some of our standard stitches in a slightly different way to create fill. So this was fly stitch, this was blanket stitch, worked around the edge and worked along the centre. Then we did Cretan stitch and herringbone stitch. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Get practicing those stitches ready for our November projects and have lots of fun experimenting with different stitches, different threads and different weights of thread as well. Happy crafting, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!